as long as it's on the same topic. A Labour member had asked a question about Transport for London and who is responsible for it. And this very day, this Thursday that we're recording, the Office for Rail and Road announced that they are issuing a prosecution against Transport for London and Tram Operations Limited, which is the brand name of the subsidiary that First Group used to run the trams in Croydon, and against the man who actually was the driver of the tram at the fatal crash in Croydon in 2016. So I took that as an opportunity to spring that on him and ask him whether he thought he had done enough, because, you know, between you and me, listener, he's actually been quite obstructive. There's quite a sort of cottage industry of people involved in that crash, the survivors of it. So 7 people were killed, but almost everybody who was in that tram, about 50-something people who were in the tram, almost all of them were injured, and many of them with very serious life-changing injuries. The tram rolled over onto its side, and the window broke. It was quite an unpleasant crash. We did actually an episode about it. I think it was about episode 5. I should look that up, and we'll put that in the show notes. But today, there's been a long-running problem with the mayor's stonewalling questions, actually from Keith Prince, who's one of our fellow Conservative Assembly members, and from Caroline Pidgeon, the Liberal Democrat Assembly member, who have been probing on this for years. I think one of Caroline Pidgeon's questions took over a year to be answered. But when I asked him this morning, the mayor said he'd been entirely cooperative and hadn't been. I think the word Fred I put to him was obstructive and unhelpful, which I think is a very polite form of what some of the families would say he's been. The hope, though, turning to the actual tangible item itself, the hope is that this prosecution will actually get to the bottom of the problem, because TfL, I should phrase this carefully, some of the information that was pertinent to what happened did not make it into the original Rail Accident Investigation Branch report, because TfL did not send it. TfL would say they weren't asked. Others might say they kept it to themselves until they were forced years later to send it in. So it wasn't included in the RAIB report. And then there was an inquest last year that finally concluded last summer, and the inquest refused to look into the circumstances of the crash, because the coroner argued that the RAIB had already done that, and it wasn't fruitful to effectively retread the same territory. So I had an article I had in City AM last year talking about all of the questions that basically I think the families were hoping would be answered during the inquest and weren't, and because the questions weren't even put, because the coroner refused to call TfL or Tram Operations Limited. So we now have a criminal prosecution that's being brought by the Office of Rail and Road under health and safety legislation against Transport for London, against Tram Operations Limited, and against the driver. I'm particularly pleased that the TfL and TOL are in the spotlight. I think it's very easy for all the blame just to be put on the driver, who definitely is not completely blameless. I mean, he basically nodded off at the controls and then ended up going into a very tight bend far too fast. But there's a whole lot of issues which we explored in detail on that previous podcast that was sort of dedicated to this, about the culture at TfL, the safety culture at TfL, and about how they just seem to allow bus operators and the tram operators to sort of, they don't impose a safety culture and safety rules. We spoke a bit about this last episode.
We've touched on this before. I personally find it odd. I find it bizarre. Coming from the railway background that I do, where industry-wide safety is the top priority. So I don't understand why TfL seem to have a black spot with some of these things, especially fatigue and fatigue management, which again, after the Clapham Junction rail crash in the 80s, came to the fore as a key safety issue, which they don't seem to be grasping. And I don't quite understand why not. It's disappointing.
I don't know. I mean, what they would say, what happens is that TfL seem to have these sort of strategies and guidance at quite a high level, which they say they have a conversation with the operators and they want them to follow. But the question I put to the head of safety at TfL, I think in January, Lily Matson, and the question that I put to Andy Byford, who's the TfL commissioner, 2 weeks ago, was, we can see examples of where they're not following best practice. We can see it. We can see the results of it in the case of fatal crashes, and we see it in lots of near misses. Why do you not just impose it? Why do you not dictate it through the terms of your contract with these people? Why do you, somebody put it to me, why do you at least, basically bus operation companies get paid by the mile that they drive. Why don't you at least not pay them for the mile in which they kill somebody? That's quite a low level of accountability. We could at least do that. And they just don't seem very keen to, they don't seem very keen to tighten up what's going on.
remember you had a transport committee, didn't you, where you had a bus driver who was leaving, and she
had just left,
gave a condemning account of how it was.
She did. Lorraine, that was December last year, and I think my opening question to her was, the mayor has this thing called Vision Zero, which is his zero transport deaths, zero road deaths in London, and I asked what I thought was quite a broad opening question. How does this mayoral strategy, how does it connect with your everyday job as a bus driver? And she more or less said, it doesn't seem to exist in the depot that she worked in.
People don't know about it. It's not talked about. It's talked about our sort of high level with senior people and commissioners.
Strategy documents and meetings in City Hall.
But actually on the front line, it doesn't seem to filter down. And the measure of any attempt at changing culture, and Vision Zero is an attempt at that, is whether it's filtered through to the front line.
I think that just reminds me, though, I think the mayor's approach to most things, really, in his role, be it the mayor or be it TfL, it's a lot of, either culture change or strategy changes or strategic documents placed, a little sprinkle here, sprinkle there, and then kept at arm's length. There's not really any more digging or focus, or I'm going to get involved in this and I'm going to make sure that there's no deaths on London's roads. It's, I did my report, so...
Exactly,
and the rest is up to you guys.
It's ownership, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I've noticed, because all of us here are coming to the end of our first year. We were all elected last year. And the big surprise for me is, when I think back to Ken Livingstone, I remember, there were significant events, like the terrorist attack, for example. I remember him standing up as the Mayor of London and really pulling the city together. I remember him being a great champion for London. I remember with previous Mayor Boris Johnson, I remember him being a great advocate for London, a great salesman for London, the Olympics, championing how great London was right around the world. What I haven't felt over the last year with this mayor, I'm trying to be objective, is I haven't felt him own anything. I haven't felt him lead anything. The police, which is in a real state, is somebody else's fault. The fire brigade is going through real issues, somebody else's fault. The TfL is somebody else's fault. There is just an offloading of responsibility, and that's really disappointing from somebody who is leading the greatest city in the world.
Yeah,